Hello, and welcome to the Feeling Good podcast, where you can learn powerful techniques to change the way you feel. I am your host, Rhonda Borowski, and joining me here in the Murrieta studio is Dr. David Burns. Dr. David Burns is a pioneer in the development of cognitive behavioral therapy and the creator of the new team therapy. He is the author of Feeling Good, which has sold over 5 million copies in the United States and has been translated into over 30 languages. David is currently an emeritus adjunct professor of clinical psychiatry at Stanford University School of Medicine.
Hello, Rhonda.
I don't know why that always makes me laugh. Hello, David. And shall I welcome all our listeners to CoronaCast 5. And on today's podcast, David and I are joined by Diana Sciano, Alex Clark, and Jeremy Carvel. Diane helped
Carmel.
David Carvel.
Nope, Carmel.
Like Carmel, California.
Like caramel candy?
Yep, that's right.
Pretty sweet.
Diane helped David design and administer a survey of our podcast listeners to learn more about how their feelings, moods, and thoughts have changed since the COVID-19 crisis began. Diane kindly posted the survey on SurveyMonkey, and she helped Alex and David in the analysis of the data. And all of us are here today to discuss the survey's findings. And so, David, would you introduce everyone in more detail?
Yes. Well, Alex Clark is a dear and esteemed colleague, former student, and now a psychiatrist, Stanford trained, and works at the Feeling Good Institute doing team CBT, and is also working with Jeremy and David on the new Feeling Great app. And so we get to hang out all the time, and Alex is also working with my son Eric on another assessment tool that we're pretty excited about. Jeremy was a Stanford student who went into the kind of public sector, was very successful in a number of startups, and then approached me to develop the Feeling Great app, a dream he's had for 10 years and dream I've had for 40 years. And so we've had a lot of chances to hang out. Dr. Diane Sciano wears two caps. One, you're a research psychologist, which to me is pretty darn awesome, but also a licensed marriage and family therapist. And then all three of you wonderful people are in the Tuesday training group at Stanford, and Rhonda is typically in that group as well, but is also temporarily on leave to do a beautiful project to help healthcare workers who are feeling distressed. So that's our crew for today. Hope I got everybody, did everyone honor.
Great. And so shall I begin by reading 3 really awesome endorsements that you received in the email?
Yeah, that'd be kind of you to do that.
The first one is from Lizzie, and she wrote, "Hi, Dr. Burns. I just received the therapist toolkit in the mail yesterday. It's awesome. Also, I just listened to your second Corona podcast, and I just really enjoyed how many distortions you found and then how you did the positive reframing. It really helped me to recognize distortions in my own thoughts that I hadn't realized before. And then I could see what beautiful things they showed about me. And I feel better already. Thank you, Lizzie." And here's one that's really heart-moving from Siggy. And she wrote, "Dear Dr. Burns, you have saved my life. I was in hypnotherapy, struggling with depression and anxiety. So much so that the only solution I could think of was suicide. Then my therapist recommended your book, Feeling Good, the New Mood Therapy, in 1999. 20 years later, I have lived a happy, good life. Once in a while, I get your book out when I feel it would help me and do me some good. Not one psychiatrist could help me at that time. I am so indebted to you. I wouldn't be here today without your book and the exercises written in the book, although it did take me a while to do them. I wish you much happiness and love, Siggy."
Well, thank you for those two. When people write in with those kind comments, it just fills my heart with joy.
Yes. And here's one from Daniel, who was one of the participants in the most recent workshop that you taught. And he writes, "Hi, Dr. Burns. Hope you're doing well. I just listened to the last 2 podcasts on helping during the COVID-19 pandemic, and they are amazing. Perhaps 2 of the best podcasts so far. I have been busy these last few weeks with some work responsibilities, but also with spending a great deal of time in team training. Most excitedly, I have signed on to join the amazing team at the Feeling Good Institute to provide online therapy in both New York and New Jersey. And I'm really looking forward to helping to bring Team CBT to the East Coast. I hope you and your family are staying well during these difficult times. Best regards, Daniel."
Thank you, Daniel. Great to hear from you. I just loved working with you at the last uh, workshop that I did with Jill. I think it was on February 9th, and Daniel kindly volunteered for a live demo, which was totally awesome. And I'm just so happy to hear from you and to hear that you're prospering and helping to bring Team CBT to the East Coast. And I want to remind our listeners too that the live workshop on May 17th with Jill on the Cognitive Distortion Starter Kit, that workshop is on. We've made it all online. There will be no in-person component to that workshop, but we're very excited about it. We've got tremendous material for you. I always love working with Jill, so if you're looking for some CE credits, go and on my website, you'll find the link to that workshop on May 17th. That's a Sunday. It'll be a full day workshop. I think you'll get something like 6.5 hours of CE credit. So I really hope you can join us. And now for the Corona survey. We had 205 respondents at the time that we analyzed the data. There have been more since that time, but 62% of you who responded to our survey were women, and 37% of you were therapists. Now, the purpose of the survey was to say, have people's feelings changed since the Corona survey? And so we asked people about 4 negative feelings. How are you feeling right now on a scale essentially from 0 to 100? How depressed are you right now? How anxious are you right now? How angry and annoyed and irritated are you feeling right now? And then how hopeless are you feeling right now? All of these on 0 to 100. And then we also asked about positive feelings, also on a 0 to 100. How happy are you? What's your happiness score, your happiness score? And how satisfied are you in your relationships with others? That's the relationship satisfaction score, also 0 to 100. Once people responded to those items, then we asked them the next question, which is, now tell us how you were feeling before the corona virus, before you first heard about it. It's the same 4 questions. How depressed, anxious, angry, and hopeless were you feeling at that time? And how happy were you at that time? And how satisfied were you in your relationships with others? So before and then we've done a lot of analyses of men versus women, therapists versus non-therapists, and we're going to give you all of those findings. But let's start at the big general level first, which is overall, how do you think people's negative feelings have changed? You might think that they've gone up. That would be an intuitive hunch. Or you might think, they haven't changed much at all. You might even think that people are feeling less depressed and anxious and angry now. So take a moment and see what you think. And then after you've come to your own, theory, we'll tell you what the data showed. Okay, we're back, and we hope you're back also. So, Alex, do you want to kind of tell us what the data showed? Have feelings of depression, anxiety, anger and hopelessness gone up in the people who responded to our poll, our survey?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I think a fun part about listening is to take a guess. So hopefully you've committed to some idea of what you think happened, and we'll start to tell you a little bit about it. In the population as a whole, negative feelings went up and went up significantly across all the categories. So for instance, like prior to the coronavirus, depression scores were about at an 18, which this is a 0 to 100 point scale. So that would come in as about somewhat for the whole population. And after the coronavirus, now they're at about 29. So this is an increase from pretty much mild levels up to getting close to moderate levels. And, you know, that's not just for depression. Across all four of the variables that we tested, anxiety and anger and hopelessness, in addition to depression, all of these in the population as a whole went up.
What went up the most, Alex?
Well, anxiety went up the most. That was a move from about 24 points, which would be just right at the somewhat, up to 38.5, which is solidly in the moderate range for the population.
So you're saying there's a lot of quite on average there's quite a lot of anxiety, depression, anger, and hopelessness right now. I see that the one that is the lowest actually before the coronavirus and at the current time is hopelessness. The hopelessness was only 13.2 on a 0 to 100 scale, so people weren't struggling with a lot of hopelessness. But now it's gone up to 23.7 or mild level of hopelessness. It's not like extreme or anything, but it's you know, it's almost doubled in the population as a whole. So now we're going to give you any other comments on that, folks, before we go on to the positive emotions?
Well, since you gave us the numbers for depression, anxiety, and hopelessness, what were the numbers for anger?
Anger went from 17.2, which was just below mildly angry, to 29.0, which is a little bit above mild anger levels and heading in the direction of moderate. Moderate would be 50, so we're still a ways from that. But there was a you know, about a 50% increase in anger levels. Anything else before we go on to the positive emotions? Okay, now we're going to ask you folks, what happened, do you think, to people's positive emotions? We measured two of them, happiness and relationship satisfaction, and see what would be your guess here. For example, you might you know, you would probably guess that happiness went down since depression went up, but sometimes things aren't as predicted. So make your own guess about that. And then make your guess also about relationship satisfaction levels. You might think that because we're all crammed together in the same house, that relationship satisfaction, and because anger levels have gone up in the population, that relationship satisfaction would go down because people are clashing more, fighting more, getting you know, cabin fever, getting irritable. But you might also have the theory that since we're closer together with family, that relationship satisfaction has increased. So that would be a good theory too. Or you may think it's a trick question and that there's no changes at all. So see what you think about happiness and relationship satisfaction. Have they changed since before the coronavirus? And just take a moment and come to your conclusion, and then we'll tell you what we found. 1, 2, 3. Now, I don't know how I'm counting, but that seemed like the thing to do. We'll call it a countdown. What did the findings show, Alex?
Right. Well, in the population as a whole, there were changes. And, you know, one of the reasons we did this study was because we kind of all had our own guesses about this. So it'll be interesting to hear what everybody here expected, and I'll tell you what the data shows. So In the population as a whole, happiness did decrease. It was at about a 50, 55, and it went down to a 41. So, we saw negative feelings went up, and here we're seeing that happiness went down. And David, you've talked about how those don't always move together necessarily, and we'll get into the percentages a little more, but we saw a definite change in that. And I think the exciting thing, or the really curious and interesting thing, is that there's been pretty much no change in relationship satisfaction. The numbers are almost identical. That people were about 58 on a scale of 100 satisfied with their relationships, and now it's about a 57. So that's held pretty strong and pretty true to what it was before.
And I would say that both relationship satisfaction and happiness prior to the coronavirus weren't, tremendously high. That a 58 prior to the coronavirus on a 0 to 100, 58 is a little bit more than moderately satisfied with relationships with others, but it's not very satisfied or extremely satisfied. So there was a lot of room for improvement. And then since the coronavirus, the happiness has fallen substantially, but surprisingly, the relationship satisfaction has not changed to a statistically significant extent. It's really the same as it was. And this is arguably good news, because it means that even in this time of social distancing and social isolation and being cut off from a lot of our usual ways of connecting with other people, that we're still feeling just as close to others as ever. So that's kind of a little positive finding among all these other negative findings. Now
Well, it's also just to chime in here, it's also kind of interesting and mind-blowing. I think oftentimes our image of relationships is that it's all about, to feel warmly towards people, you've got to spend time with them and be connecting with them all the time. And that image may just be radically wrong. Like maybe, relationships we are kind of, if you feel warmly towards someone, even if you don't see them, that default will continue, regardless of whether you're spending a lot of time with them. Maybe relationships don't have this kind of upkeep that we might sometimes think that they need. Or, I know I might not see, I've got all these friends from high school and I might not see them for a year or even a couple of years. And then when we do finally hang out, it's just like we pick up right where we left off and nothing's changed. And so maybe that might be an interesting potential
Well,
conclusion.
as
Maybe
well
we're
as we've got
connecting.
other ways of connecting. Like I
Yeah.
know you, Diane, connected with your family on Sunday to a great extent, and we had a family get together on Saturday via Zoom, and I'm sure yours was via Zoom too. And actually, we wouldn't have gotten together with my daughter and our grandson and my son-in-law. Uh, if it hadn't been for the coronavirus, we wouldn't have gotten together on Saturday. But we scheduled it, and it was fun. We had anticipation of it. We were excited about it. And then some fun emails got exchanged afterwards. And my grandson got a chance to sing a song from this play he's going to be in. He's the Shrek in some musical that his school is putting on. He was very excited. My daughter and he sang this kind of duet type of thing,
Nice.
and it was really
So,
really
yeah, maybe
sweet.
people are actually spending as much time socializing as they were in the past. That would be an interesting follow-up research question. It looks like Diana has something to say.
Yes, so thank you for adding that, Jeremy, because I think you illustrated exactly what's so fascinating about this kind of research, but also where you have to be cautious, right? So we deliberately worded this question vaguely to cover all relationships, and we didn't ask about how often or how you're connecting. And so the idea is to get an overall measure, and then we can look more closely into questions about whether you're talking about relationship with people that you're sheltering in place with, or if you're talking about people overall, or if you're talking about people that you haven't seen for a while. So it's intriguing. The result is fascinating, but it certainly engenders more study. to come up with.
Right.
And then can I raise a question too?
Yeah, right. Yeah.
And then, how would you explain that, often if people are already in abusive relationships, stress can exacerbate the risk of intimate partner violence, and with the stress of unemployment or reduced or lack of income and the decrease of, kind of protective measures that people have to go to a friend's house is gone, or go to the court is gone, or even go to a shelter for battered women. We can't really do that anymore. How does that come, how would you bring that information into your data analysis?
Well, I can't explain it personally because with the increase in anger in our respondents, and yet there was no change in relationship satisfaction. And yet you pointed out that recent United Nations report that I think was in the New York Times or something on this people with this massive increase at abuse hotlines and things like that reporting a tremendous increase in domestic violence. And I can't reconcile that finding. As you say, Diane, this is something that requires further study. Now, our data, we're not claiming it's representative of the population as a whole. This is representative of people who come to my website, feelinggood.com, and receive my blogs or get them on Facebook and read them, and the people who agreed to go to the link and fill out the survey. And so while I think it would be very highly likely that the findings in this survey will generalize to the many people who go to my website, and we have more than 100,000 downloads a month on our podcasts, Feeling Good podcast now. While we're generalizing to that population, we're not trying to generalize to the to the general population of the United States. And so, like, if I know you do a lot of work with forensic work, Rhonda, so you deal with tremendous amount of domestic violence and that type of thing. So a survey of your population, of your patients and people you work with, would likely show, very, very different kinds of results.
Right.
Well, how about, so we've done the positive and negative feelings. Now, how about gender differences and therapist differences? Who's getting more upset, men and women? And how are the therapists doing? The therapists, we have all these tools for helping patients. Therapist, physician, heal thyself is some kind of a biblical statement. How are we as therapists doing compared with people who are not therapists? So let's start with the gender findings first, and then we can look at the therapist findings. Would you think that men or women have had a greater increase in negative emotions? And then you might also want to ask yourself, what emotions changed the most in men and in women? If you think that the depression, anxiety, anger, and hopelessness have gone up, which ones do you think have gone up the most in women, and which ones have gone up the most in men? So just take a moment and see what you think the results showed, and then we'll do the big reveal. Da, 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 da. Alex, can you tell us what the findings showed?
Sure. Well, we looked at the population as a whole before, at both the time points, but we didn't talk about the gender differences before necessarily. So when you look at men versus women before the pandemic across these 4 negative feeling domains, were they the same or were they different is the question. And it turns out before the pandemic, there was no statistically significant difference. So when we looked at the numbers,
before you go on, let's just say what that means. That means before the pandemic, men and women had approximately equal levels of hopelessness, depression, anxiety, and anger. There were no gender differences before the pandemic hit.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And so now we look at, what about now? What about after the pandemic? Have there been differences that emerged? And the answer is that there definitely have. And when we look at the 4 categories, so let's start with women. So in women with the 4 categories, now that you listeners know that there's differences, maybe we'll have you take a guess real quick. Do you have any guess on which of the four, maybe for women, have increased? Are there certain ones that haven't changed at all, or certain ones that have dramatically increased? So take a second and think about that. Take a guess.
I'm gonna play the listener, and can I do that and make a guess?
That'd be fantastic.
I would guess that depression would go up in women.
And you'd be right. You'd be right. But are you saying that your guess is that would go up and the others would stay the same?
Yeah,
or
that
what?
would be my guess, that depression would go up. Maybe anxiety would go up a little, and the rest would stay the same.
Well, I see here that depression has almost doubled in women, went from 17.3 to 33.1. You had calculated the percent increase. Do you have that list handy, Alex?
Absolutely. Yeah. So for the depression, the change in women was actually a 92% increase.
How about anxiety in women?
Well, that Rhonda is right again there. There was definitely an increase in that, but it was actually as substantial, in fact, identical to the increase in depression, 92%.
Right. And in women, actually, anxiety was much higher than the other emotions because it started at 23 and went to 44.5. And that's almost at the moderate level, which is people in treatment would have a score, seeking psychotherapy would have a score like 44 on anxiety. 50 would be moderate, 75 would be severe, and 100 would be super extreme. And so the average anxiety level in women in our population right now is very high. What was the increase in anger in women, Alex?
Well, anger and
women don't get angry typically, right?
That's right. That's right.
It went up. It went up significantly, and the increase there was a 70% rise from prior to the pandemic.
Wow. How about hopelessness? Did that also go up in women?
Well, this is really the standout. If we were to say that there's a standout, because they all increased by nearly almost double, but hopelessness went up into the triple digits, 114% increase from prior.
And women, wow.
Women, yeah.
Wow, that's amazing.
And now how about in men? I'm assuming that all four emotions increased in men as well.
Well, why don't we let everybody take a guess who's listening? What is your guess on that? And we'll pause and da 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 da.
I'm guessing that women are from Venus and men are from Mars or something like that, and so that means something about emotions, that women are more comfortable with emotions. Is that what that book claimed? And men are happier with playing with trucks or something like that.
I don't know what the book claimed exactly, but if it was something along those lines, this seems to start to resonate with that, because men did have an increase, but not in everything, and in fact only in one thing. So the anger category rose for men, but the other three, depression and anxiety and hopelessness, at least in our study, in our sample, stayed the same as before. And then we can talk about maybe how much they increased, and people might have guesses around that, but it's just the anger.
Just focus on the anger. How much did the anger increase in men?
So the anger in men went up by 70%.
Wow.
Now, anger has increased in men and women since the coronavirus. Is that correct?
Right.
And so does that mean that both men and women are angry then?
Were they angry then, and are they angry now? Is the question?
Yeah, like we know that men and women's anger levels didn't differ before the coronavirus hit, and now they've gone up in both men and women. So would they be similar now in men and women? Similar anger levels?
I see what you're saying. Exactly, actually. So they were the same before. And they're the same now, and by the same I mean for men and women, they've increased equally. 70% increase since the pandemic.
Oh, interesting.
But Alex, can I ask you a question?
Sure.
So men's level of depression, anxiety, and hopelessness have not gone up.
those have not gone up. Those stayed, at least from a statistical perspective, identical to before the pandemic, the levels.
And
And we can give you some
are you
numbers.
taking a look at this data and making a conclusion from it? Like,
Well, I
are
think,
men not as open to feeling, I
One
don't
con-
know, depression, anxiety, and
one
hopelessness as much
well,
as women?
I'll tell you one conclusion that I had, but
Yeah.
all these things are speculative, as Diane points out. They're just things that could be looked into more if one had the interest. But generally, when they've gone from door to door with these multi-million-dollar surveys of what kind of struggles people in the general population have, almost all of these studies report higher levels of depression and anxiety and lots of other mood problems, much higher in women than in men. And our findings might provide a partial explanation for that. No one knows why women have more negative emotions than men. There are many theories about it, all of which are easily to show are not true. In our field, virtually all of our theories can be shown to be not true. They're just things that people make up. It could be, a genetic difference, who knows what. But it looks from our study, which is a small little study of 200 people, that women are more sensitive to these kind of stressful threats than men. That maybe women are more emotionally responsive than men, which could certainly be something that would make women look maybe a bit more human, a bit more vulnerable, a bit more emotional. That's just probably BS what I'm saying, but it would be one way to think about our data.
I just, from a closer look at the open-ended question responses that we'll get to later, but I looked at that for women versus men. More women were talking about changes in their lives, and having to deal with kids, staying at home, and that kind of thing. So I think women's lives have really changed a lot. Their role has increased a lot, I think. But again, this is not statistically significant or anything like
I
that.
love what you're saying, Diane. So it could be something as simple as since a lot of women, or like we did a follow-up survey with Taylor. We've done 2 live sessions with Taylor, a psychologist in New York, who now has to run her practice. Plus, she has 3 little children she's taking care of.
Yes.
And
Yes.
during the Corona cast, our second interview with her, her children were climbing all over her, and, oh, mommy, I need this, and mommy, I need that. So that would, I love your hypothesis there.
And
Diane.
there's a complaint with women. It's a cultural thing, right? Women tend to be delegated responsibility for the kids more. And I forgot what I was going to say. Oh, women complaining about not having alone time for
Yeah.
themselves, went up. Was there in the qualitative responses. So it's just something to consider.
I think it's huge what you're saying, because, and we've talked about this a lot in the Tuesday group, that women are under so much pressure now, because you're supposed to give 100% time to your career, because a lot of women now have careers, and then you have to give 100% time to your children, and you have to give 100% time to your marriage, and that women are perhaps in a vulnerable position of being highly subject to stress and pressures and demands that are arguably excessive and unreasonable. So how about gender differences in positive emotions? Have we talked about that yet, Alex? Do we need to have a hypothesis for our listeners?
Well, we haven't gotten to that at all. And, now that we've seen differences in the negative feelings between genders, people might be starting to form ideas around how that relates to the positive feelings. And so we could have anybody here who had a guess maybe before we did the survey, or, everybody out there, take a minute and think about your answer.
Overall, happiness went down in the population, and relationship satisfaction did not change. But now we're going to break it into men versus women and see if you have any particular predictions or hunches about how the data will come out here. You have your answer now? Da 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 da, the big reveal.
Well, like you said, David, you know, happiness went down since the pandemic, and it turns out that it was the same for both genders. There was no difference between men and women in the happiness decrease.
So just to summarize, in men and women, happiness went down, and it went down to the same degree in men and women. And then relationship satisfaction stayed the same overall. How about men versus women?
Yeah, well, let me say one more thing before we talk about that. We've been given percentages too. So just to revisit the happiness thing, you said, you know, on the whole, even before the pandemic, people scored about a 55%. So that's only in the moderate range. And now it's dropped to about a 41. So that's about a 26% decrease.
Yeah. And then how about in men and women on relationship satisfaction? Is one gender doing better there?
So it turns out that they're identical. No change for the population, no change for each gender.
Okay, so any discussion on that before we do the big reveal on how therapists are doing?
Yeah, David, how do you explain that? That happiness went down, but relationship satisfaction was pretty flat and stayed the same. Doesn't happiness relate to relationship satisfaction?
Well, I'm glad thanks for bringing that out because I've done additional analyses on these data, but I published an article in the top psychology journal in the 1990s. I think it was entitled Intimacy and Depression, Is There a Causal Connection? Because theorists for years have been trying to figure out what's the connection between depression and happiness on the one hand, and how we feel about intimate, loving relationships on the other hand. And some cognitive therapists have said that you know, depression would lead to poor relationships because people who are depressed think negatively and they wouldn't feel as cared about and as loved and that type of thing. And then other people like Clareman and Cole, I think, are the two who have this thing called interpersonal therapy, which was developed as a placebo therapy for depression in a depression outcome study, so they could compare cognitive therapy to some other kind of therapy that wouldn't work. And then it turned out that the interpersonal therapy was as effective in the treatment of depression as cognitive therapy. So people wrongly concluded, Clareman, that an important cause of depression is trouble in intimate relationships. And the reason I say it's a wrong conclusion is because just because you treat someone and they get better, that doesn't show why they got better. Mm. And so I studied the connections between depression and relationship satisfaction in hundreds of patients who came to my clinic in Philadelphia, and then studied them again 12 weeks later. And at both time points, depression was negatively correlated with relationship satisfaction, as you would think. It was a minus 0.42 was the exact correlation. And it was exactly the same 12 weeks later. And so high relationship was associated with high relationship satisfaction was associated with low depression and vice versa. If you were very depressed, you had lower relationship satisfaction. And then changes in relationship satisfaction were correlated with changes in depression, as you might expect. But the study was the first to show that there were no meaningful causal connections between your intimate relationships and your depression. And in other words, what that means is that if you were very depressed and then you recovered, that would not, in fact, have any causal effect on your satisfaction in your marriage or relationships with others. And similarly, if you had a troubled relationship and then were able to improve it dramatically, that would not cause an improvement in your depression. And I was able to replicate those findings in the data we collected. In fact, I did the exact replication study yesterday using an exact mathematical model I had used in the 1990s. There were zero causal connections between the two. And that's why you see when the happiness went down, it didn't affect depression or relationship satisfaction because there are no causal linkages there. Relationship satisfaction doesn't result from depression or unhappiness, and vice versa.
Well, that's interesting.
It's controversial,
Yeah.
and a lot of people have not quoted my paper, even though it was statistically pretty definitive. And because people didn't necessarily like those conclusions, because the people who want to believe that the way to treat depression is to help people with their relationships, they don't want to give up that belief. And that's one of the reasons, I've been trying to develop a data-driven, science-based form of psychotherapy so we could go with what the data shows us rather than what we believe, because we sometimes believe things that aren't true.
But that same result might be tremendously exciting to some people too, because, like when I was younger, I was kind of a jerk, and I wasn't
What do you
good.
mean when you were younger?
Yeah, well, I didn't say it stopped. It's just, but yeah, and it was, and having good relationships was challenging.
Yeah.
I didn't have like, I wasn't one of the super cool popular kids in middle school or whatever. But what your data shows is that someone like that might be able to be completely happy and
Yeah.
be really enjoying life, and it wouldn't mean they wouldn't also want to have great relationships. They might like to fix that problem too, but it means they could kind of work on their happiness and develop a really satisfying life alone before trying to focus on having great relationships with everyone.
I love what you're saying, and I'm in 200% agreement, because if you don't have a partner and you're needy and telling yourself, oh, I've got to have a partner, you put yourself under so much pressure that you drive everyone away.
Yeah.
Once you give that up and discover you can find happiness within yourself and you have joy to share with others, then people are naturally much more likely to be attracted to you. Well, that's a great point, Jeremy.
And it's optimistic too for people in the coronavirus era that, hey, even if you are alone and maybe you're not interacting with people through Zoom, you might be totally satisfied. I actually know a couple of people, like my fiance's dad, who I think he's kind of excited to have all this alone time.
Yeah.
He likes to work on mechanical projects. He finds it really fun. Sometimes he gets kind of overscheduled with social obligations. I think he's just loving being alone right now.
Learning in my own life, when I was a psychiatric resident, when I was learning cognitive therapy, I once went to one of Beck's weekly seminars, and he said, love is not an adult human need. And I thought, I used to think the guy was a sociopath. Now I know he's a sociopath. It sounded so horrible to say that. But then I did an experiment and tested it out in my own life, and I found the longer I was alone, the happier I became. And it was such a shock to the system, and it's been very helpful to be able to share that with lonely patients as well. But going back to our data here, and again, thanks for that fun diversion, which illuminates what we're doing and adds such nice color. And Diane's going to give us a lot of color in just a minute. But are we ready for the therapist findings?
That sounds great.
Okay, so we have two kind of therapist findings. How did the therapist compare with non-therapists before the coronavirus and since? And how have the therapists compared with non-therapists in the happy feelings as well as the negative feelings before the coronavirus hit and at the current time? So let's look at the negative findings first. Before the coronavirus, do you think therapists were doing better on depression, anxiety, and anger and hopelessness better than non-therapists? And then at the current time, how are therapists comparing with non-therapists? So you have two things to guess. So see what you think. Do you have your theory? Okay, What was the answer, Alex?
Well, the answer was before the coronavirus, there was a difference between therapists and non-therapists in the negative feelings. And the difference was about 7.7 points. So therapists were significantly less in their scores of negative feelings. Non-therapists had higher levels of negative feelings.
Yeah, so to simplify that, there was a slight difference between the coronavirus, between therapists and non-therapists, and therapists were doing a little bit better. So it seems like maybe therapists do have some tools that give a bit of an advantage in dealing with negative feelings like depression, anxiety, hopeless, and anger. And then what happened since the coronavirus, I assume that those differences increased, and the therapists are doing, way better than non-therapists now. Is that what happened, Alex?
Well, the point you made about tools is interesting, is because you would assume that therapists had the tools to be treating and helping themselves with intense negative emotions. And that doesn't seem to be necessarily as true. If you look now at what's happened since the virus, things have changed and everyone is the same. There's no difference between therapists and non-therapists now in levels of depression, anxiety, anger, and hopelessness. So,
interesting. So we maybe aren't healing ourselves any better than anyone else under this conditions of extreme stress worldwide, at least in the population we looked at that, and that's kind of surprising. How about on the positive feelings then? I assume then that therapists are also not doing better on positive feelings. What did the data show there?
well, I'd say this is a pretty interesting thing. If you look at happiness and relationship satisfaction, therapists actually are doing better, and they're doing better at both time points. So on average, they were about 10 points higher on happiness and on relationship satisfaction than non-therapists at both time points.
And that has continued since the coronavirus. Therapists are still doing better than non-therapists.
Yeah, that's continued to hold.
Okay, great. Any discussion of these somewhat puzzling feelings? And again, if we were super keen on this, we could put out a much bigger survey to see if we can get replication before trying to sort it out. But any ideas that anyone has on this?
So again, from the open-ended responses, and again, there's not large numbers here, but you just get an idea from them. If you think about it, women's role is more intense now, and therapists' role is more intense. Many of them are seeing clients through teletherapy, which they hadn't done before, or they find difficult, or there's some amount of skill they need to acquire. But also, they are they're not getting the personal interaction in the way that they expected, so they have to change their techniques a little bit. But mostly, I think they're talking about hearing about their patients feeling more intense mental health problems. So there's been some discussion about, this mental health wave that's coming over after the wave of the virus and the wave of economic problems. There's at least public recognition that there are mental health issues involved, and our data is showing that in the quantitative section. And I think it makes the work of the therapist somewhat harder. It's just from a few results, but I think it makes sense.
And there's new adjustments for therapists too, having to learn teletherapy, new tools. I'm still learning to use Zoom. There's a lot to it. It's pretty easy. And in my teaching, I have found it more stressful to be, you were teaching the Tuesday class on Zoom, and to me that's more stressful and more demanding. So again, I love what you're saying. Can you tell us a bit more about the open-ended questions and what conclusions you drew by reviewing people's responses to, I think, 4 open-ended questions we asked?
Sure. Yeah, and again, these were just very broad, open-ended questions. I wanted to get a large sense of the diversity of responses, and then they could be looked at later with more specific questions or by group, like gender and therapists. So I'm mostly going to focus on the overall findings, but We talked a little bit about differences for women and therapists. Anyway, my first question was about how long ago did you first learn about the COVID-19 virus? And almost uniformly, it was 8 weeks, and that would have been the end of January, because this was done at the end of March. The survey was done at the end of March. So it was when China was first going into lockdown. And, but I think the important thing is that becoming aware of it didn't mean taking it seriously way off in China. And there's a quote by one person that I think is illuminating. That person says, "I remember hearing about it when it first started in China, but I wasn't overly concerned. I felt like it was a bad flu and it would likely blow over. Then I watched the news unfold, particularly in Italy, and realized how serious this is. Once they started shutdowns in California, I realized again how serious and close to home this is." So you could see that over time, people were starting to take it more personally and become more concerned about the effect on themselves. And it was a gradual thing, but it took place over about 8 weeks.
That's awesome. Tell us more of your findings. I love this because it shows the humans behind the numbers. What else did you find there in the
Okay.
open-ended questions?
So another question was, what are your primary concerns? And by far the most common concern had to do with the fear of serious illness or dying, catching the virus, obviously. But that included people who were concerned about loved ones, especially the most vulnerable loved ones. So people often mentioned aging parents, grandparents, people who they know that have some comorbid conditions. So there's
I'm glad I'm not in any of those groups.
Right. So there's this fear of getting seriously ill or dying for oneself and one's loved ones. And then it extends out to, the world at large, and then increasingly to first responders. There's the next.
Just one more comment. It just sounds like people were showing a lot of compassion in their concerns.
Yes.
Yeah, it's also fascinating that people are so that's the top concern when there's also millions of people who've lost their jobs, and people's 401ks and retirement savings have taken like a 30% hit or 25% hit on
Right.
average. And so people being more concerned about the virus than the economic input, the economic effects, is actually pretty fascinating and maybe surprising for people in the media who are saying that, oh, maybe we need to open up, or people are really concerned about open up. It sounds like people are more concerned about getting sick and dying right now than the economic side. It
Well,
could change, but that's
yeah. So the next two most common responses are connected and might connect to what you're saying. The first had to do with, how am I going to endure this personally? And that included fear of financial disaster, loss of jobs, so forth. But also meant fear about challenges to one's mental health and physical health. So economics fits in here, but it fits in a number of ways. The third one was fear of whether we'll ever get back to normal. Those terms, get back to normal, were very common in terms of both our economy and our way of life. So it's health. How am I going to endure this? And are we ever going to get back to normal? And so I think sometimes people didn't specify finances, but they did say the economy and our way of life. So it's there. Again, it's hard to tell numbers with qualitative data. So those were the primary concerns. When I then asked people, what are you doing to cope? The top three approaches, and by and large, the most frequent was connecting with friends, connecting with loved ones, both with whom you're sheltering in place and through Zoom. The use of televideo it is major and a major form of coping. Another is trying to keep busy with projects, with routines and schedules, especially in families with children who need to do, school-related activities. So connection, trying to keep busy, and working to keep up one's health, both physical and mental. So a lot of people are trying to do exercise. And these people that have been responding from the podcast blog, it's very clear that they're trying to use David's team CBT kind of approach, which I thought was pretty fantastic. Some admitted to binge watching and binge eating and the occasional use of alcohol, but
That's been those three things have been my favorite things during the coronavirus. Eating too
yes.
much, watching too much TV. Tiger King is great for those of you looking for recommendations, and
Yes.
drinking alcohol. I've been relatively modest, but I have a big stack of delicious uh, craft beers, and I drink one a day as my coronavirus consolation prize.
So some people see that as a way of coping, others don't.
I think they might be onto something. At least
Right.
I think watching and eating in moderation is kind of okay. Like once every 100 years when a pandemic comes around, maybe that's all right. That's not something that David would endorse necessarily, or is actually good advice. But I'm just
what I
kind of
would say
saying
is
it.
if you want to drink beer, go for it, but don't drink Corona.
Diane,
Okay,
I was
yeah,
having a
great.
thought about what you were saying in a general sense too, about how people are coping and the distress that people are feeling. We saw everybody's emotions are on the rise. Even both genders are having rises, and people are having drops in happiness. And we talk about the distancing and social connection. And one of my favorite things is to be with my patients and to work with them together. And I've done video therapy in the past, but now video therapy is all that I do. And I've actually been hugely surprised at how amazing it is. I've been able to connect with people in ways that in some ways are even better than in person, because we can work together on some of the tools. There's a focus level that can be different when you use teletherapy. And so I think one of the things that we see out of the data is that if our small study is indicative of the larger kind of world, then I would be hoping that people are reaching out, because there's probably more of a need for mental health care. Don't hold back. If you're thinking teletherapy maybe doesn't sound great, I'd say go for it, because my experience as a therapist has been fantastic with it. I love working with people. Reach out to us. Give it a shot however you want. I think that you can really connect despite what's going on right now.
I think that's a great suggestion for most people. So thank you for that. And it segues right into the fourth question, which was simply, what do you think of telehealth? That is online video or phone therapy. And people really fall into distinct camps on this.
And we're going to make this real quick because we're running out of time here. But I'm fascinated to hear what they said.
Some people love it, some people hate it. Most people overall hadn't used it, or just a few times, but they thought it wasn't ideal, but it would be good under the circumstances, and they were just starting to use it, and some were very pleasantly surprised. I would just note that therapists seem to have overall, that in a large part, again, this is qualitative, many are using it or are planning to, and there was just this note that it may require some skill to use well. It takes some, it can be draining for a therapist, but other people have said that they found it very satisfying and rewarding, maybe after an initial practice period. I'm not sure, but it's good to have your response too.
Thank you so much for that, Diana, and thank all of you who completed the survey. I was pretty excited that we could just get some data and make sense of the data. So this is a new tool that we might be able to use in the future too. Let us know if you liked the survey, if you liked our report, and if there are other survey questions that you'd like to see answers to. You might give us some cool ideas to do more work. I was also able to do some causal modeling with the data to look at basic science questions like what's the connection between relationship problems and depression, that's hugely important. I was able to confirm a previous published finding in a very convincing way. So there's gold in them, our hills. We didn't use any big words at all. We tried to make it just clear, simple results for you. If some of you who are more into statistics and surveys, we analyzed the data with a program called AMOS, AMOS. That's the analysis of moment structures, and that's a structural equation modeling program developed by James Arbuckle in Philadelphia. It's now being a part of the stats package called SPSS. But all of the findings that we're reporting were hugely statistically significant and more or less written in stone from a statistical perspective. But thank you, Rhonda, for bringing your warmth and wisdom and joy and to this and to all of the podcasts. And thank you, Diane, for bringing your tremendous critical eye based on, graduate training and research experience, which is fabulous. And thank you, Alex and Jeremy. It's always fun hanging out with all of you. So everybody have a terrific day, and then until next time.
Thank you so much, David.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks for bringing your wisdom to this.
Thanks, David.
Thank you.
This has been another episode of the Feeling Good podcast. For more information, visit Dr. Burns' website at feelinggood.com, where you will find the show notes for this episode under the podcast page. You will also find archives of previous episodes and many resources for therapists and non-therapists. We welcome your comments and questions. If you want to support the show, please share the podcast with people who might benefit from it. You could also go to iTunes and leave a 5-star rating. The theme music is Gypsy Jazz in Paris, 1935, composed and performed by Brett Van Donsel. I am your host, Rhonda Borowski. We hope you enjoyed this episode. I invite you to join us next time for another episode of the Feeling Good podcast.